I've been told to speak in English, so I will try my best. Thank you very much for your invitation and especially also for this warm welcome and introduction. I'm very happy to be here today and to witness the launch of this Promotionskolleg. Both, one could say, would not be so obvious, and certainly not self-evident, given the history of intersectionality in Bayreuth. Or one could also say, the two of us, Bayreuth and myself, have history. This history is not personal, it's systemic. Before I want to draw on on what this systemic contains, please bear with me when my first thoughts will be on the very current affairs of Berlin's state election. As a hearted Berliner, since over 30 years, who is passionately invested in Berlin's hyperdiversity, and with that, in the decades push and interventions of the Black and POC civil society, social movements, last night's election repetition was more as just a question of political choice and positioning. This election, which results are now in, but its consequences are still not certain today, went to the core of the social implications of intersectionality. Over the last years, Black and POC civil society and its social movements went into an intensive dialogue with the government coalition of Berlin on political and administrating solutions of burning questions of systemic injustice and inequality, such as racial profiling, discrimination, and systemic exclusion of racialized groups, but also on questions of epistemic justice, etc. Berlin would become the first state in Germany to implement an anti-discrimination law which regulates discrimination and systemic forms of exclusion executed by the state, in addition to the law that was implemented so far within the civil realm of our society on the federal level. This was an acknowledgement of the fact that racism, discrimination, and different forms of exclusion were systematically embedded and needed to be addressed systematically. We didn't get this far in Berlin without heated and strong discussions and especially community-based knowledge building over the last decades, which, by the way, did not only collect demands, but generated data, methods of capturing systemic racism and multiple applied discriminations. So the political implications could build upon this knowledge. These movements, like ADEFRA, ISD, and various POC NGOs, were and are also strongly embedded in a transnational diasporic exchange on the effects and potency of systemic racism and discrimination. It was in this discursive context which these movements generated that the transnational attention of the Black Lives Matter movement could finally be popularized in Germany after the public murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. A momentum was laid out. The federal government developed an action plan on racism and acknowledged the systemic relevance of racism. Berlin went one step further and acknowledged the need to protect its citizens also against these effects and carried out by the state itself. So also all of this above is already part and parcel of the importance, effects, and origin of the concept of intersectionality. I can feel the question rising in the room. Why am I starting my thoughts on intersectional knowledge as interventional turn with just this one election? Well, one of the opposition parties, led its campaign with the demand and promise to confiscate this law since it would not protect enough the police. As this law allows also to acknowledge, give language and political handle to collective experiences of racialized and marginalized Berliner in and with other authorities, such as schools, kindergartens, universities, state and district administrations, regulatory offices, the Department of Corrections, Justice, or Fire Department, etc. This is a direct threat to the achievements of a collective intersectional struggle and an extension to an intersectional turn in the public life in Berlin. So I probably should have concentrated one more time on my thoughts today. When I arrived last night in Bayreuth, I clued to the news on the election developments and thought about what is at stake, not only in Berlin. Another connection which can be drawn to the launch of the intersectional studies in Bayreuth today is the implementation of the United Nations Decades for People of African Descent from 2015 until 2024. Berlin was the first state to commit itself to this decade and to take up measures for it. One of the crucial is an implementation in the academia, as intersectional Black studies started last year. Under the leadership of Professor Maureen Marisha Aouma, the Technical University laid out a cooperation between the Berlin universities and the RAA Berlin, an NGO working in the field of educational justice. Led by Katja Kinder, the RAA Berlin advanced to the center part of Black feminist criticism of structural racism and of intersectional practices in educational system in Berlin. The third partner in this cooperation is with Professor Fatima El-Tayeb at Yale University, whose work is based on Black European studies. We, from the Federal Agency of Civic Education, BBP, are connected to this project with an emphasis on an intersectional Black studies transnational network for a mutual transfer of public political practices and academic theories. We are entering the final phase in the United Decades for People of African Descent. These achievements are still fragile and still a work in progress. They need support, but first and foremost, a political commitment. On the federal level, the implementation of an advisory board will draw onto these steps and hopefully deliver more milestones. So there was and still is a lot at stake. This is the context my thoughts are embedded. However, it should not come across as a depressive reflection on the current state of intersectionality in Germany. Much more, these references to the current affairs playing out right now in Berlin can motivate us even more. When we understand what intersectionality means and makes available to us, we are not bound to be drawn into a track of disappointment. Turns are always accompanied by backlashes. They always seem to be under siege. So while intersectionality requires a lot of us, I want to offer 3 steps with which intersectionality and its abilities to social turn can be easier understood and made available. 1, intersectionality as a commitment. 2, intersectionality as a process change. And finally, 3, intersectionality as epistemic and resource justice. Intersectionality as a commitment. When I'm speaking of intersectionality, I'm speaking of political intersectionality, as Professor Aouma already laid out, based on Kimberly Crenshaw. As implemented the collective experiences of Black women into the system of law, Crenshaw works helps us to dig deeper in our understanding of diversity, and that especially for the German term Vielfalt, which is not diversity. The theorist of intersectionality and legal scholar took on the limited understanding of race and gender in the legal system, and by that pointed out to the racialized logic, which brings out those binaries as the Black women encountered in the litigation against General Motors in the 1980s. So on the one hand against Black men, and on the other hand against white women. This is a powerful binary of discrimination and often still informs definition of racism and sexism. Intersectionality, but in the interaction of various social and applied categories, act in a more complex way. Intersectionality, as it has been developed by these feminist protagonists, refer to a void in this complexity and show us that we usually concentrate on the most privileged and those groups who are confronted with racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination and marginalization. But experiences of discrimination and exclusion can strengthen each other or, on the contrary, lessen each other. In the case against General Motors, this would mean that the experiences of sexism that white women encounter can be lessened by their proximity to power through their sharing of whiteness. So the Black women would be fired first. The experiences of racism that Black men encountered can be lessened by their proximity to power through sharing maleness. So the Black women would be fired first. The inscribed logics of racism, sexism, and further classism, ableism, etc., dominates our systemic acting. Intersectionality, narrating these underlying dynamics, allows us to look closer and develop models of competences to make collective experiences in participating in public life understandable. It turns intersectionality in a pragmatic tool to visualize and structuralize criticism of discrimination, as Auma pointed out in Intersektionale Gerechtigkeit und intersektionaler Feminismus, Intersectional Justice and Intersectional Feminism in 2020. However, simultaneity and multidimensionality of different structures in equality cannot be simplified as multiple discrimination, Mehrfachdiskriminierung, as it usually has been translated into German. So it's not really language translating, it's actually kind of concept translation. The German use still understands multidimensionality as an addition of categories of inequalities, and by that discrimination. In doing so, it almost entirely took out the category of race and implies that an intersectional understanding or analysis of discrimination can be done without it. This is how intersectionality becomes inflationary and even more depolitically. Thank you. You might remember when I stated in my opening that Bayreuth and I have history. 10 years ago, Bayreuth started a promising new academic interdisciplinary space, the Academy of Advanced African Studies. I had the pleasure to work in this academy together with Professor Susan Arndt on the conceptualization of futures in African and African diasporic knowledge productions. With other disciplines like ethnology, anthropology, history, and others, I was the only Black scholar from Germany. The Academy's vivid exchange with African universities brought scholars from the African continent and other diasporas for a limited amount of time to the discussion in the German context. The Academy thought of itself as being truly intersectional. However, the racial logic of German and African scholars remained in the already described binary. That also meant that the German epistemic foil equaled German as white and remained white. Even further, the understanding back then was that it is possible to do its own research grounded in this foil, not clarifying or positioning oneself within the realm of race and whiteness. This means to depoliticize the similarity and multidimensionality of different structures of inequality. Especially working with and in such a sensitive field as African studies from the standpoint of German academia in this way reproduces epistemic coloniality. The Bayreuth Academy of Advanced African Studies, studying in African issues without race, reproduced coloniality of knowledge, positioning, epistemic and colonial logic. Some of it was started to deconstruct. Systemically, one could argue with Rommelspacher that there was, and I quote, a discrepancy between the right to equality for all people on the one hand, because that was the idea, and the conscious enforcement of inequality on the other. An intersectional understanding which goes beyond simplistic binaries includes knowledge about racial groups which are more affected from structural exclusions than the general statuses of the racial group itself. This is also one of the needs of revisions in the Allgemeine Gleichstellungsgesetz, so the anti-discrimination law of the federal state from 2006. This federal law draws its protection on the basis of isolated categories of discrimination, and by that does not work for the experiences of people within one position group who are encountering multiple forms of exclusion. Intersectionality as a commitment would mean not always only or primarily represent the most privileged members of a social group, but to place the multiple marginalized members at the center of political participation strategies and to address the respective discrimination relationship with first and foremost from these multiple marginalized positions. Intersectionality as a commitment does not simply require a maybe different political standpoint. It means to gain a deeper and wider understanding of the higher risk of discrimination for certain groups or members of these groups. Intersectionality as a commitment puts its focus consequently on the processes of destigmatization and increase of participation of those and recenter the role of public and own institutions. 2, intersectionality as a process change. Intersectionality intervenes in persistent inequalities with the intention of making the inequality constellation, the dominance constellation, and the discrimination situation in all its complexity more visible and comprehensible. It also offers us the opportunity to understand and break through the entanglement of different structures in inequality, which are also manifests itself in various politics of representation. The intersectional term can also be understood as an intervention into the entanglement with power dynamics within marginalized groups itself. As the concept based on collective experiences of Black women is being further developed, it was crucial to its analysis to also focus on intra-categorical heteronormative dynamics within certain groups. Leslie McCall advanced the tools of intersectionality with these 3 axes. The already discussed intercategorial, defining the interlocking of power dynamics based on different collective categories. By detaching this analysis from and focusing on intra-categorial intercategorial effects, its interventional turn is also possible within the BIPOC social movements itself. As movements also operate in a system based on racial logics, they tend to make themselves intelligible to this very system by reproducing the norms of the most privileged ones, like focusing on academic degrees, certain legitimatized knowledges, languages, formal education, etc. In my work at the BBP, the Federal Agency of Civic Education, the intra-categorical focus on intersectionality becomes a more and more burning question. Guilty as charged, I also need to develop strategies which do not predominantly align to the interests and realities of the most privileged ones of marginalized groups. The RAA Berlin work is based exactly in these intra-categorial dynamics, and her leader, Katja Kinder, helps me again and again to make sense of this messiness of these dynamics. The third axis McCall offers to the discourse is an anti-categorical focus. It speaks to the paradox of simultanealities and overlaps in moments and elements of identities. It helps us to avoid hasty determinations of categories of discrimination. We should be open for unexpected constellations, similarities, and paradoxes. In conclusion, third, intersectionality as epistemic and resource justice. Intersectionality aims, of course, to justice. Within academia, epistemic justice takes on its very own business of knowledge production, being the reproductive source of collective anchoring. While questions of knowledge like what knowledge is leading, what knowledge is turned into sources, is cited, and by that, what knowledge goes into an hegemonic collective anchoring, are important to each intersectional academic project. Epistemic justice means more. It does not only start with knowledge supposedly born in the institution, but also needs to include knowledges as described above. Community-built and movement-embedded knowledge is collective knowledge. It cannot simply be transferred in the hegemonic logic of knowledge. Intersectional approaches would need to make a change in the concepts of academic narratives embedded in linear historiographies, protagonists, mostly white male, written sources. Intersectionality asks for epistemic justice to recentering knowledge, like those of the Black feminist workers at General Motors. And it also focuses on resource justice. This goes beyond the question of fellowships or other positions within the project. It goes right to the core of the structural self-understanding of the university. Is it still this understanding of Germanness as in the Academy of Advanced African Studies, or do people experiences multidimensional systemic exclusions who experience multidimensional systemic exclusions find themselves represented in the structure of this university? Structure is built by people. So yes, it could mean to see a representation of diversity as in our society we live in. However, structure is more. It speaks to the accessibility of the space, the language, and addressing it, of those, how it chooses the connectivity to communities and movements. I think it is safe to say that intersectionality offers various interventional turns. Some of it have yet to come. Thank you.